In 1888, an Ojibwe elder spent 3 days telling his grandson about a world that no longer existed. He spoke about the copper mines around Lake Superior, about the people who worked for them, and about the structures that stood there before the forests returned. What stayed with his grandson was not the mines themselves. It was a single question. If ancient people removed enormous amounts of copper from the Great Lakes, where did it all go? Because even today, archaeologists agree that an extraordinary amount of copper was taken from the region thousands of years ago, but only a fraction of it has ever been found. The elder believed his ancestors knew the answer, and just weeks before he died, he decided it was finally time to pass that answer on. If you want to understand why an Ojibwe elder would spend 3 days talking about copper before he died, you have to start with Lake Superior. Because Lake Superior is not simply another mining region. It is one of the strangest copper deposits on Earth. Along the southern shore of the lake, particularly around Michigan's Kiner Peninsula and the islands farther north, copper exists in a form found almost nowhere else in the world. Not copper or not rock that needs industrial refining. Pure metallic copper, sometimes lying close enough to the surface to be worked directly with stone hammers and fire. For thousands of years, people mined it. That part is not controversial. Archaeologists have documented ancient mining pits across the region, thousands of them. Some are small, others stretch deep into the rock itself. On Royale alone, researchers have identified thousands of prehistoric extraction sites scattered across the island. The scale surprised even the first surveyors who arrived there in the 19th century, because these were not random holes dug by occasional travelers passing through. They were mining operations organized, planned, repeated generation after generation. Then comes the part nobody agrees on, the numbers. Depending on which estimates are used, researchers believe ancient miners removed anywhere from hundreds of thousands to well over 1 billion pounds of copper from the Great Lakes region over thousands of years. Even the lowest estimates are enormous. The highest estimates become difficult to imagine. And that creates a problem because archaeologists have not found hundreds of thousands of pounds of ancient copper artifacts. They have not found millions of pounds. They have found only a fraction of what appears to have been removed from the ground. Some of it traveled astonishing distances. Great Lakes copper appears in burial sites hundreds and sometimes thousands of miles away. Artifacts made from it have been discovered throughout the Mississippi Valley and deep into the American Southeast. The trade networks were real. The movement of copper was real. But the accounting still refuses to balance the copper went somewhere. The question is where? That question existed long before internet theories and long before modern debates about lost civilizations. Surveyors working in the 19th century asked the same thing. Researchers asked the same thing. And according to a grandson writing down the final words of an Ojibwe elder in 1888, his people had been asking the same question for generations. Because according to the old man, the story of the copper mines did not begin with the Ojibwe. The Ojibwe inherited the memory of the mines just as they inherited the stories attached to them. Stories about the people who came before. Stories about the island in the Great Water and stories about a time his grandfather referred to only by a name that appears again and again throughout the account. The time before the silence. That was where the story truly began. The grandson who eventually wrote down his grandfather's final testimony made one observation that researchers continue returning to. The old man never spoke about the copper mines as discoveries. He spoke about them as inheritances. That distinction matters because by the late 19th century, the Ojibwe already knew the old pits scattered across the Kino Peninsula and Arroyal. Many of them were impossible to miss. Some stretched across hillsides. Others disappeared beneath forest floors that had grown over them for centuries. When the first American surveyors reached parts of the region in the mid-19th century, they reported finding mining trenches, hammerstones, wooden supports, and extraction pits on a scale that surprised them. Some of the pits were enormous. Others had collapsed long before anyone arrived to record them. The question was never whether mining had happened. The question was who had organized it. By 1888, archaeologists already understood that copper extraction in the Great Lakes region was ancient. What they could not explain was scale. The amount of copper removed from the region appeared to exceed by an enormous margin the amount ever recovered from archaeological sites. Copper from Lake Superior had reached Ohio. It had reached Illinois. It had reached Louisiana. It had reached the Gulf Coast. Chemical analysis would eventually confirm that some artifacts discovered thousands of miles away originated in the Great Lakes deposits themselves. The trade network implied by those discoveries was extraordinary. The production required to support it was even larger. The old man believed the answer existed long before archaeologists started asking the question. According to the grandson's accounts, these people understood copper differently. They built with it, they shaped landscapes with it, and they left behind structures near the water that survived long enough to enter memory before eventually becoming what the elder called dressed in earth. Not ruins, not foundations, not buried buildings. Structures dressed in earth, covered, hidden, absorbed into the landscape itself. The elder offered no theory for what happened to them. He spoke about them the way people speak about weather or winter, as something that happened, as something remembered, as something that left traces behind for those who knew where to look. And according to him, the traces were still there. The farther researchers pushed into the copper story, the stranger the numbers became. Ancient miners had removed enormous amounts of copper from the Great Lakes region. On that point, there is very little disagreement. The disagreement begins the moment someone asks a simple question. Where did it go? Copper from Lake Superior has been identified hundreds and sometimes thousands of miles from the mines themselves. Artifacts carrying the chemical signature of Great Lakes copper have appeared in Ohio burial sites, Mississippi Valley ceremonial centers, and settlements scattered across the eastern half of North America. The trade network implied by those discoveries was enormous. The mining effort required to support it was even larger. And yet, the amount recovered by archaeologists represents only a small fraction of what appears to have been extracted. The accounting does not balance. It never has. The elder who spoke in 1888 believed the problem existed because historians were asking the wrong question. According to his grandson's notes, his grandfather never described the copper workers as miners in the modern sense. They were not simply digging metal from the earth. They were working with something they understood in a way later generations no longer did. The old man struggled to explain this part. His grandson struggled even more to translate it. The closest he could come was this. The people who came before did not force the copper into shapes. They worked with the nature of the copper itself. The grandson admitted he never understood what his grandfather meant by that. But the old man kept returning to the same idea. Knowledge, not tools, knowledge. According to the account, the people who worked the grape mines possessed methods that survived only in fragments after the silence came. Then came another detail that separated the elder's account from almost every archaeological theory that existed in his time. The first copper workers were not described as one people. They were several peoples. Trade moved across the lakes. Knowledge moved with it. And among them were individuals who came, according to the elder's words, from the direction where the sun is oldest. The phrase appears only once in the surviving notes. The grandson never attempted to explain it. Perhaps he could not. Perhaps his grandfather never intended him to. What survives in the account is the effect these people had on the landscape around the mines. According to the elder, they built near the water. They left markers near the routes connecting the lakes. And long after they disappeared, some of their works remained visible enough to enter memory. Not cities, not towns, structures large enough to be remembered, old enough that nobody alive knew who built them. The phrase used by the elder was unusual enough that the grandson copied it exactly rather than attempting to improve it. He called them structures dressed in earth. The phrase appears nowhere in known Ojibwe traditions collected by 19th-century ethnographers. It appears nowhere in missionary records, nowhere in Smithsonian reports. Only here, in one testimony, in one family record, in one conversation that lasted 3 winter days in 1888. Structures dressed in earth, not destroyed, not erased, covered, hidden beneath the landscape itself. The old man believed some still existed. He believed the land behaved differently above them. Water moved differently. Plants grew differently. Animals avoided certain places for reasons hunters could never fully explain. Most importantly, he believed these places had not been forgotten by accident. They had been left behind deliberately because, according to the account, the people who built them understood something else before they disappeared. Something was changing. The water was changing, the land was changing, and whatever was coming next would end the world they knew. The elder had a name for that moment. He called it the silence. And according to him, everything that survived afterward belonged to the world that came after it. Most people have never heard of Isle Royale. Today, it is a national park sitting in the cold waters of Lake Superior, nearly 50 miles from the Minnesota shoreline. In summer, it receives a small number of visitors. In winter, it almost disappears from the world. But long before it became a park, long before it became protected land, Isle Royale was one of the largest copper mining regions in North America. Thousands of ancient mining pits cover the island. Not dozens, not hundreds, thousands. Some are shallow surface cuts, others descend deep into the bedrock itself. Archaeologists have known about them for more than a century. The first major surveys in the 19th century left investigators with an uncomfortable problem. The mines were too large, too organized, too extensive. The amount of labor required to create them seemed completely out of proportion to the societies they were supposedly describing. Then came the timber discoveries. Surveyors reported finding wooden support structures buried deep inside some of the old workings. Not branches, not rough supports placed in desperation. Engineered timber. Large beams moved into locations that would have required planning, manpower, and organization. The reports mentioned them. The published summaries barely did. That gap appears repeatedly throughout the earliest investigations of the Great Lakes copper fields. Observation on one side, publication on the other, and between them, silence. The old Ojibwe elder spoke about that silence as though it had a beginning, as though there had been a world before it and another world afterward. According to his grandson's account, one place appeared repeatedly during those final 3 days, an island in the Great Water, the ice isle of Red Rock, Minong Isle Royale. The elder spoke about the island with the familiarity of someone describing roads he had walked himself. Not a legend, a place. He described old workings, old routes, old places that had names long before maps arrived. Then he described something that does not appear anywhere in the archaeological literature. He spoke of structures that stood near the mines, structures connected to knowledge rather than habitation. The grandson struggled with the translation. Eventually he settled on the phrase places where the copper was taught, not mined, not worked, taught. The grandson admitted he had no idea what his grandfather meant. Researchers who later read the account had no idea either. Copper can be extracted. Copper can be traded. Copper can be shaped. But taught, the old man never explained further. Apparently he believed explanation was unnecessary. The words themselves were enough. Write them down. Someone else will understand later. That instruction appears several times in the surviving notes. Write it exactly even if you do not understand it. Because understanding was not always meant for the person carrying the memory. Sometimes memory survives one generation simply so another generation can recognize it when the time arrives. Then came the final detail. The elder insisted that some of what existed before the silence had not been destroyed, only hidden, only covered, only left for another time. The phrase his grandson preserved was unusual enough that he copied it without changing a single word. Sealed for later, not lost, not forgotten, sealed for later. Objects, knowledge, places waiting beneath forests, beneath soil, beneath generations of history that forgot they were standing on top of them. Whether that memory describes history, symbolism, or something in between remains impossible to know. But more than a century later, the mines remain, the pits remain, the missing copper remains, and the question the old man carried into the winter of 1888 remains as well. If the people who worked the copper disappeared, why does so much evidence suggest they expected someone to come looking for them again? 3 weeks after the old man finished speaking, he died. His grandson would later write that his grandfather did not look exhausted after the 3 days of talking. He looked relieved, as though he had finally put something down that he had been carrying for a very long time. That detail may be the most important part of the entire story because the elder never asked his grandson to prove what he had heard. He never asked him to convince historians. He never asked him to win arguments. He asked him to remember because memory disappears differently than buildings disappear. Buildings collapse. Metal corrodes. Wood rots. Memory disappears only when the last person carrying it is gone. And according to the elder, that had already happened once before. The people of the Copper Country had disappeared. Their structures had disappeared. Their knowledge had disappeared. But not completely. Pieces remained. The mines remained. The pits remained. The copper remained. Even the questions remained. Questions that archaeology still struggles to answer. Who removed so much copper from the Great Lakes? How was mining organized on such a scale? Why does the amount extracted appear so much larger than the amount ever recovered? And perhaps the strangest question of all. Why do so many traditions around Lake Superior speak as though the mines were inherited rather than discovered? The old man believed the answer lay in what he called the time before the silence. A world remembered only in fragments. A world that left behind pits, islands, stories, and traces scattered across the northern forests. A world that, according to him, expected to be forgotten but not forever. Because before he died, the elder left his grandson with one final instruction. Write down what you do not understand. Someone else may understand it later. Perhaps that is why the story survived. Not to prove anything, not to settle history, but to make sure that when people finally start asking the right questions, the memory is still waiting for them. Thank you for watching. And before you leave, let me leave you with the same question the old man left behind in the winter of 1888. If the copper miners were only a legend, where did the copper go?